One thing that's important about Lisa's work is the content. It's so heavily and self-consciously full of symbols, things that mean something, this literary quality, and it's really clear to anyone even looking at them for the first time that it has that kind of metaphoric action going on. So I do, and I also think that's the first thing that people get engaged with when they see the work. So I want to talk about that. I want to talk about some content, what the symbols mean to Lisa, where some of it's come from, that interweaves with biographical things and the sort of story arc of your life and all the places you've lived and studied and all the theories, and there's all of that. And we're going to start with that because I think the paintings start with that in a way. But then what I also want to do, and one thing that has really fueled my conversation with Lisa over the years, is this other thing, which frankly, it kind of blows both of our minds that more writers don't pick up on when they're talking about her work, because it's written about extensively, and for some reason, I seem to be the only one, except for Peter Frank-A-Little, who gets that the formal situation with the work is actually kind of where the action is. The fact that in any given painting, there's between 2 and 6 or 7 different ways of making an image, different styles at work. And in some cases, it's more obvious than others, but that there's, almost every object has its own way of being put together. There's abstraction, and some of it is clean, and some of it is messy, and there's, serious realism, and there's things that are more hybrid in between those. And that what a lot of people don't realize is A, how interesting that is just from a sort of art historical point of view, but also that there's symbolic and psychological and emotional and narrative content in those choices also. And so we're just going to that's pretty much, I think, all, those are the sections of the conversation, right? So that's what we're going to be talking about, and jump in anytime. And I really just want to start with, I guess we should start with the birds, because there's the flora and fauna, the birds, the vines, the flowers, these are things that throughout Western art history, which you've studied in at least 2 or 3 continents at this point, many different perspectives on the sort of march of art history. But birds and flowers have symbolism that goes back to like the Bible, right, all the way through the present day. And so, there's a few major, I guess if you could just maybe tell, we could start with talking about the most obvious things, the birds. That's the kind of theme that runs through the whole thing. That would be great.
Well, I think the birds are, I know we're going to the symbology thing, I get all that, except for I don't really think of all these things symbolically.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, you recognize that very
I totally recognize that, and I see how people will come to that immediately because it's an access point for anyone, including myself, if I hadn't made these. But I think, for me, it's more working from a truly subconscious place. I have very little idea what I'm going to paint going in, and I always used to say to my students, if you have a good idea, or if you think you have a good idea, it probably isn't. Because you've thought it up as an idea, and those are generally, I'm sure all artists work very differently, but I know that if I think I have a good idea, it means that I have consciously arrived at that idea one way or the other, either by looking out in the world or referencing something else. And it generally doesn't work out for me. It may work out for another artist, but it doesn't work out for me that way. So I have very little idea what I'm doing when I first head out into a painting. And with these particular paintings, I think you see that they all have a kind of foregrounding in the background. Mm-hmm. And that's about as much as I know. And my default position is always that of the formal. And I know that about myself. Okay. So it's a color choice, it's a composition choice. Always.
A stock brush work. So you would rather think, in your studio, would prefer to think about how you're doing it rather than what you're doing.
Right. Right, and it also speaks to this idea of having a number of different paint handling maneuvers going in the same painting.
Which this is the perfect painting to sit in front of you. There's 1, 2, 3, different ways of making an image in this one composition.
Yeah, and it's not that I don't know that, or I'm not aware that the paint will carry a certain look. I'm aware of that. That's real clear to me. And sometimes it's divisive, meaning I want that look, so I know I have to do that thing for that look.
For example, the difference between the kind of pixelated, really rough abstraction in the background, it's still going to read as sky, but it really doesn't look anything like a sky. It's square, it's got square clouds, versus this that's really naturalistic, the way it's rendered, but is upside down and cut in half.
And I would use a bird rather than an elephant, and why would that be? Because birds are free. I mean, that's all I care about. Birds are free. I relate to the idea of a bird as a symbol of freedom. And you know this idea of the free and easy mind, the free wandering mind of, you know, Lao Tzu, and that the artist really has to be a free person. If they're, you know, being sort of trapped by the minutiae of life, or being, I think, drugged down by tasks that one doesn't really want to do, is not the mind of free and easy wandering. And I think it's, for me, it's very necessary to have that mindset.
Do you think that has to do with your personal ancestry?
Yeah, I think it has to do with my personal ancestry. As a
European gypsy.
Correct. My great-grandmother was from Budapest. My grandfather was from what was former Bohemia. And my mother was born on the Czech Republic border in Germany. So they really were Romana people. They were gypsies. And I think it's a DNA thing.
Oh, it has to be. I mean,
and it has informed my life, both good and bad. I mean, you can imagine being in a society
where one pays one's taxes, one is gainfully employed.
You don't do that.
You know, 7 or 8 major kinds of symbols that recur. So if you're approaching each canvas separately, how do you explain that?
Well, I think
alliteration.
Any artist comes to a certain, I guess, lexicon of images, right? That they favor or that they would prefer. And of course, there are things I like to look at because they're visual art statements. But I think there's also something about, specifically for painters, there's something about the desire, for me at least, the desire to feel the feeling of how it feels to paint that specific object and what that requires in terms of the feeling to paint it, which results in how it gets painted. The way it kind of works is that I really don't know how to paint the thing. So I look at it and I think, you know, I have to start.
As the thing being the flower,
the object,
line, the
right?
bird,
the subject, right? I have to figure something out. So if my desire, and the one object I'm thinking about right now are those dandelions, probably because I'm looking at them.
The weeds right here.
Yeah. So I looked at these little puff balls, and I hadn't really a clue how I would paint that. I've never painted one.
Why did you want to?
Well, because I kind of like the way they look, but I also like this idea of what they mean. So when you blow at a dandelion, it kind of spreads around.
And the making of the wish.
The making of the wish, right? And it kind of just blows away. But I thought, well, okay, I can't paint this thing in any way that I know already how to do that, so I have to make something up. So everything I paint, I make up as I go along, because I've never painted them before. Now, there's obvious repetition, like there's certain vines and so forth, so I have those down really well.
But then there's also paintings in the back where at the bottom there's a ledge where they dissolve and choose.
Right, and then there's some...
They fall apart sometimes, and sometimes they don't.
Right, and there's something about the notion of dystopia. If you were to just paint these paintings without some foil in them, without some edge that just made them look either bad, imperfect, questionable,
complex,
complicated,
yeah.
You know, they wouldn't be that interesting if you just painted a bunch of dandelions.